Something is breaking open inside the American national security establishment right now, and it cannot be ignored. Frank Kendall, former Secretary of the Air Force and senior fellow at the Center for American Progress, is now saying publicly what many inside the system are whispering privately, that Trump has lost control of this war. That is not a partisan talking point, that is a career military professional, someone who has spent decades watching how America wages war, looking at what is unfolding in real time, and using the word blunder, a historic one. The US and Israel launched strikes against Iran on February 28th. Iran retaliated almost immediately, firing drones and ballistic missiles at US military bases across Bahrain, Jordan, Kuwait, Qatar, Saudi Arabia, Turkey, and the UAE. Now the Strait of Hormuz is closed, and the US Energy Secretary has admitted the Navy is not yet ready to escort commercial vessels through it. Former Defense Secretary Leon Panetta called that a serious failure of planning for what he described as an obvious consequence of any war in this region. Retired Army Colonel Lawrence Wilkerson, former Chief of Staff to Colin Powell, put it bluntly, "This is a war with long legs. Trump has completely misinterpreted it." He warns that Iran has not even begun launching its most sophisticated missiles. Meanwhile, Democrats who sat through classified Iran briefings walked out describing the administration's strategy as incoherent. Think about that. People with access to the full picture, the intelligence, the war plans, the projections, and the word they are using is incoherent. This is not about left or right. This is about whether anyone in Washington actually has a plan for what comes next. Now let me get information on the war's stated objectives, casualties, and broader geopolitical implications. The United States and Israel launched surprise airstrikes on Iran on February 28, 2026, killing Supreme Leader Ali Khamenei and dozens of top Iranian officials, and Iran responded with a wave of drone and ballistic missile strikes against US military bases across Bahrain, Jordan, Kuwait, Qatar, Saudi Arabia, Turkey, and the UAE. That was the opening. And what followed tells you everything about the nature of this war and the question hanging over it, not whether America's military is powerful, but whether anyone in Washington actually knew what they were doing when they lit this fuse. Let's start with the justification, because this is where you can feel the ground beginning to shift beneath the entire operation. From the very first hours after the strikes began, the Trump administration's stated goals have been a moving target: preventing Iran from getting a nuclear weapon, deposing the Iranian regime, stopping an imminent attack on US forces, destroying Iran's missile capabilities, eliminating its navy, and ending what they called 47 years of Iranian aggression against America. That is not a strategy, that is a list. And the difference between a strategy and a list is the difference between knowing where you are going and simply hoping that movement equals progress. Pentagon officials in private briefings told congressional staffers that the US does not have intelligence indicating that Iran was planning to preemptively attack the United States. So the very premise that justified going to war on the timeline they chose, the claim of an imminent threat, was not backed by the intelligence community's own findings. Now, Trump is a man who has built a career on projecting absolute confidence. He called the war a short-term excursion and said, "We already won the war in many ways." But then, in the very same breath, he said, "We haven't won enough," and vowed to continue with more intensity. That contradiction is not spin. That is a man who does not have a defined exit. When Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth was asked whether the war is at its beginning, middle, or end, he said it is up to Trump to decide. And when Trump's own envoy, Steve Witkoff, was asked by CNBC how this war ends, he answered, "I don't know." Those three words, from the president's own man, deserve to be repeated and thought about carefully. A war that has already killed thousands of people, destabilized global energy markets, and deployed additional thousands of US Marines into a region on fire. And the president's own envoy says he does not know how it ends. 10 days into the conflict, Trump still had not settled on a consistent rationale for why he went to war. His top officials were not even aligned with each other. Defense Secretary Hegseth said it was not a regime change war. Then Rubio framed it as a preemptive strike. Then Trump himself said in his own words that it was absolutely about regime change. Senator Mark Warner, a Democrat who sat through the classified briefings, summed up the absurdity precisely when he said he was not sure which of those goals, if met, would actually mean they had reached an endgame. That is a member of the Senate Intelligence Committee saying, after seeing the classified picture, that he cannot identify what winning looks like. This is not a partisan attack. This is a statement of strategic incoherence. And then there is the hardest reality of all, the one that military planners and historians understand deeply, even when politicians refuse to acknowledge it. The short-sighted notion that enough precision strikes would trigger a wide Iranian popular uprising has slowly been exposed as a sham. Aerial bombardment makes for strange bedfellows among the bombed. You cannot bomb your way to a political outcome that does not exist on the ground. The American military is extraordinary. Its hardware is unmatched, but it has bombed governments before and watched those governments survive, harden, and outlast the campaign. US forces have struck nearly 2,000 targets in Iran since the war began, eliminating several top Iranian officials, including the supreme leader himself. And yet the ruling system has shown no signs of collapsing. What happened instead was telling. The joint strikes killed Supreme Leader Ali Khamenei, and the regime replaced him almost immediately with his son, Mojtaba Khamenei, in what was widely read as a signal of defiance from the theocracy and the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps. Trump had reportedly wanted a say in who would lead Iran next. He expected to be heavily involved in choosing Iran's next leader. Instead, the IRGC made that decision themselves, rapidly and without asking Washington. Iran's foreign policy advisor told CNN bluntly, "I don't see any room for diplomacy anymore, because Donald Trump had been deceiving others and not keeping his promises." That is the message from Tehran. Not weakness, not the beginning of a surrender, defiance. Both Trump and Netanyahu had hoped the opening strike would rapidly destabilize the regime. 13 days later, both understand that has not happened. A senior source who spoke with Trump described the president as enthusiastic about continuing the war for another 3 to 4 weeks, with the theory being that if the IRGC is degraded enough, an internal uprising becomes possible. That theory deserves real scrutiny. It was the same theory applied in Iraq after 2003. It was the same theory applied in Libya. It was the same theory applied every time American air power believed it could manufacture political transformation from 30,000 feet. And each time the result was not a grateful liberated population installing a pro-Western democracy. The result was chaos, hardened resistance, and a power vacuum that created problems far worse than the ones the war was supposed to solve. Now let us talk about what this war is doing to the American economy and to the global economy, because this is where Frank Kendall's warning about a historic strategic blunder stops being abstract and becomes concrete and immediate. The conflict disrupted approximately 20% of global oil supplies transiting the Strait of Hormuz, causing prices on the Brent crude oil market to rise from around $70 to over $110 per barrel within days. Americans are warily eyeing prices at the pump as oil shipments through the Strait of Hormuz grind to a halt amid the threat of Iranian attacks on vessels. And this is not just about gasoline. From the metals market to agriculture and autos, a de facto closure of the strait is rippling through business sectors and both the US and world economy. Roughly 1/3 of global fertilizer trade transits that strait. Petrochemicals, plastics, electronics, pharmaceutical inputs, aluminum, all of it flows through that narrow channel, and right now most of it is not flowing. Iran's IRGC stated it would not allow a single liter of oil through the Strait of Hormuz, and an IRGC spokesperson declared, "Expect oil at $200 per barrel. The price of oil depends on regional security, and you are the main source of insecurity in the region." Iran is using the strait as a weapon, and the United States, the most powerful military in the world, currently does not have a clean answer to it. Trump has repeatedly floated the possibility of using the US Navy to escort commercial shipping through the strait, but the Pentagon has yet to conduct such operations amid concerns about the risks posed by Iranian attacks in the narrow waterway. US Energy Secretary Chris Wright acknowledged that Washington was not ready to provide Navy escorts, but that such operations could begin by the end of the month. Not ready. 2 weeks into a war that the administration launched. The Strait of Hormuz was always going to be Iran's most powerful card. Anyone who studied this theater knew that, and yet the Energy Secretary had to admit on live television that the Navy was not ready to escort tankers through it. Goldman Sachs economists modeled a scenario where Brent crude averages $98 in March and April, which would raise their 2026 US inflation forecast by 0.8 percentage points and trim GDP growth. In a more extreme scenario with oil averaging $110 for 2 months, they see inflation at 3.3% and GDP at 2.1%, and they raise their odds of a recession this year by 5 percentage points to 25%. Oxford Economics modeled a scenario in which global oil prices average $140 a barrel for 2 months, what they characterize as a breaking point for the world economy, enough to push the Eurozone, the UK and Japan into economic contraction and create an economic standstill in the United States. These are not fringe forecasts. These are the numbers that the world's largest financial institutions are working with right now. Retired Army Brigadier General Mark Kimmett told CNN that the U.S. strike on Karg Island has raised the stakes considerably. It's gone from a take out the military, take out the regime, to trying to take out the economic lifeblood of this country, he said, adding that if Iranian oil infrastructure is fully targeted, Iran will attack the rest of the Middle East's infrastructure, and at that point, oil prices will just go out of control. Think about what that means in practical terms for ordinary American families. Your grocery bill, your gas prices, your heating costs, your mortgage rate, which is sensitive to inflation expectations. The ripple effect of a prolonged Hormuz closure does not stay in the Middle East. It arrives at your kitchen table. Frank Kendall, the man who ran the Air Force for 4 years, supervised more than 600,000 personnel, and managed a budget exceeding $200 billion, has published op-eds in the New York Times and USA Today, warning that the current legal chain of command for the military is made up of yes-men who will not push back on anything Trump or Hegseth commands. This is not a Democrat making a political point. This is a 4-star level civilian who spent decades building American air power, and he is saying publicly that the safeguards that are supposed to prevent exactly this kind of unplanned, open-ended conflict from spiraling, the institutional pushback, the internal oversight, the honest counsel to power, are no longer functioning. Kendall warned specifically that concerns about U.S. munitions could mount significantly if the war drags on or involves American troops on the ground, an option that Trump said he would not rule out, and Secretary of State Rubio himself acknowledged that Iran is producing, by some estimates, over 100 missiles a month, compared to the 6 or 7 interceptors that America can build in the same period. That asymmetry is not a footnote. That is a fundamental problem for a sustained air campaign. The U.S. can bomb for months, but not without depleting its vital munition stocks and facing both greater political damage ahead of November's midterm elections and the risk of more U.S. casualties. Iran will continue to lose launchers, drone bases, personnel, and infrastructure, but enough will likely survive that its forces never have to stop. And here is the deeper truth that history keeps trying to teach powerful nations. You can destroy a country's hardware without destroying its will. The IRGC has watched its commanders get assassinated. It has watched its supreme leader killed, and its response was not to collapse. It was to close the Strait of Hormuz, rain missiles across 6 Gulf nations, and install a new, younger supreme leader as a declaration that the regime intends to outlast this campaign. There is also an increasing recognition among military planners that destroying Iran's enriched uranium stockpile, which Iran would need to produce a nuclear weapon, would require U.S. forces on the ground, since it is buried too deeply underground even for U.S. bunker-buster bombs. And when Trump was asked about putting troops on the ground to secure that uranium, he said, "It's something we could do later on. We wouldn't do it now." That answer is the sound of a war whose actual strategic goal, the one that supposedly justified all of this, remains unachieved, and the president himself is acknowledging it cannot be achieved with air power alone. The nuclear material that started this entire chain of events is still in the ground, still intact. Recent polling shows Trump's decision to attack Iran has not come with the rallying around the flag effect that typically accompanies the start of recent U.S. wars. About half of voters said the military action makes the U.S. less safe, while only about 3 in 10 said it made the country safer. That polling number is historically unusual. Americans have historically, at least initially, supported their president when war begins. It is a deeply human instinct. The fact that this war began with roughly half the country already skeptical tells you that people sense something is wrong. They may not be able to articulate it in precise strategic terms, but they can feel the absence of a clear purpose. They can see the shifting explanations. They can read the gas prices at the pump, and they are connecting those dots. What is unfolding here is not a simple story of American strength being projected into the world. Iran has, within 13 days, turned this into an endurance test that it seems to be surviving. The limitations of U.S. air power are exposed. It can alter regimes in terms of their capabilities or leadership figures, but it has not forced Iran to change its methods, and it has not forced regime change. For Iran, survival is victory. They do not need to win a single battle. They need to outlast the political will of an American president who campaigned on ending foreign wars and who now owns one of the most complex and consequential military engagements in a generation. A senior Arab official involved in mediation efforts told Axios that Tehran has made clear it has no intention of stopping the war on Washington's timeline, And so we are left with the question that Frank Kendall and every serious national security professional is asking right now. What does the endgame actually look like? The most practical option remaining for the US may be a coercive settlement rather than a ground war, a situation where Washington reaches an understanding with elements of the regime, conceding enough on missiles, nuclear restrictions, and regional behavior to let Trump claim success. In other words, the war may end not with the triumphant transformation of Iran into a democracy, not with unconditional surrender, not with regime change, but with a negotiated, face-saving arrangement that looks roughly like what diplomacy might have achieved before a single bomb was dropped. That possibility should be taken seriously, because the alternative, a prolonged air campaign that depletes American munitions, keeps oil above $100 a barrel, risks dragging in other actors, and produces no political transformation on the ground, is the definition of a historic strategic blunder.